at 39 years old, stood on a $20,000 hand-knotted Persian rug and felt like a ghost. His annual salary, which had peaked at around $72,000 from the auto shop he'd built with his own two hands, wouldn't even cover the cost of the art on the walls of this living room. A single abstract painting, a chaotic splash of blues and grays, had cost his father-in-law $85,000. It was supposed to represent a storm at sea. Jerome thought it represented a Tuesday afternoon oil change gone wrong. Right now, it felt like it represented his life. He was a black man of average height and solid build, his hands calloused from years of wrestling with engines and changing tires. Those hands, usually stained with a fine layer of grease that no amount of industrial soap could fully remove, were now scrubbed raw. He had wanted to look presentable for this conversation. He wore his best clothes, a pair of $120 slacks and a crisp, white $80 dress shirt. Across from him, his wife Keisha and her parents Marcus and Eleanor formed a tribunal. They were seated on a sprawling white leather sofa that probably cost more than his first car, a 1998 Toyota Camry he'd bought for $2,500 and kept running for a decade. Marcus, a man whose deep brown skin was always encased in a suit that cost no less than $3,000, cleared his throat. He wore a $15,000 Rolex President that gleamed under the recessed lighting. "Jerome," he began, his voice smooth and final, like a judge delivering a verdict. "We've been discussing the situation." The situation was the death of his business. Jay's Auto Excellence, his dream, had flatlined 3 weeks ago after a catastrophic loss of its primary commercial contract. The doors were chained, the tools were being liquidated, and his pride was scattered all over the floor of the empty garage in Houston's 3rd Ward. Keisha, stunning in a silk lounge dress that cost a cool $600, stared at a spot on the wall just past his ear. Her long, elegant braids were coiled into a perfect bun at the nape of her neck. She hadn't looked him in the eye for days. Eleanor, her mother, was a study in quiet disapproval, her lips a thin, unmoving line. She wore a simple cashmere sweater that Jerome knew from an accidental glance at a receipt had cost $950. "It's a tragedy what happened to the shop," Marcus continued, the words utterly devoid of tragic feeling. "A real shame, but business is business." He leaned forward, the leather of the sofa sighing under his weight. "The reality is, that business was the connecting tissue of this arrangement. It was your contribution." Jerome felt the air leave his lungs. Arrangement? Contribution? He had thought it was a marriage. He looked at Keisha, a desperate plea in his eyes. She finally met his gaze, but her expression was blank, polished, impenetrable. It was the same look she gave a waiter who brought the wrong appetizer. "What my father is trying to say, Jerome," she said, her voice as cool and crisp as a starched sheet, "is that this isn't working anymore." Then came the final blow, delivered by Marcus with the detached precision of a surgeon. "You're finished, Jerome. The business is gone. Your purpose here is concluded." He gestured vaguely around the opulent room, at the glass walls overlooking a perfectly manicured garden. "This is a certain world, with certain expectations. You no longer meet them." Eleanor added the practical stinger. "We think it's best for everyone if you take your things and go. We'll give you until the end of the week." Take his things. Go. The words echoed in the cavernous space. He thought of his toolbox at the shop, his name engraved on each piece. He thought of the small collection of books in the guest room, the worn photograph of his parents on the nightstand. These were his things. They would fit into the trunk of his 10-year-old sedan. He looked at the three of them, their faces calm, resolved. They had discussed this. They had planned this. He was being let go like a redundant employee. In the home he shared with his wife, he was being laid off. And in that moment of crushing humiliation, standing in the heart of their River Oaks estate, Jerome felt a cold, quiet clarity settle over him. They thought he was finished. They had no idea how wrong they were. What do you do when the people who are supposed to be your family tell you you're worthless? Do you fight? Do you scream? Or do you just nod, say okay, and start planning? Let me know in the comments what you would have done in his shoes. The facade had been beautiful, but it had always felt like a movie set. Jerome remembered the first time he'd had dinner at their River Oaks home, 2 years before the wedding. He'd been so nervous his palms were sweating, and he kept wiping them on his new, slightly too stiff $90 jeans. He'd brought a bottle of wine, a $40 Cabernet Sauvignon he'd agonized over at the store, hoping it was impressive enough. Marcus had glanced at the label, given a tight, dismissive smile, and said, "How nice. We'll save that for the kitchen staff." He then proceeded to open a bottle of French Bordeaux that Jerome later learned cost $800. That night, seated at a dining table made of a single slab of polished mahogany worth at least $30,000, Jerome had felt like an exhibit. Marcus, a real estate mogul who had built his empire on shrewd, often ruthless acquisitions, spoke at length about his latest project, a glass tower in downtown Houston. "The margins are thin, but the prestige is immense," he declared, gesturing with a fork. "It's about legacy." Jerome, whose legacy was built on honest work and fair prices for brake jobs and engine diagnostics, had simply nodded. His own business, Jay's Auto Excellence, was thriving in its own way. He had a loyal customer base in the 3rd Ward, a neighborhood with a deep, vibrant black culture that felt a world away from the sterile perfection of River Oaks. He had 2 full-time mechanics working for him, and he was clearing a respectable $72,000 a year after expenses. It was a good living, a life he was proud of. "And what about you, Jerome?" Eleanor had asked, her voice dripping with polite condescension. "Still playing with your cars?" "Business is good, Eleanor," Jerome had replied, keeping his voice steady. "We just landed a fleet maintenance contract with a local delivery service. It's a big step for us." Marcus had laughed, a short, barking sound. "Fleet maintenance. Excellent. Every empire needs its stables." Keisha had reached over and squeezed Jerome's hand, a gesture that was meant to be reassuring but felt performative. "Daddy, be nice. Jerome works very hard." She was wearing a simple black dress that day, which he later discovered was a $2,400 Burberry piece. On his wrist, his trusty $89 Timex watch, a gift from his late father, felt heavy and inadequate next to the glitter of their world. The contrast was a constant, unspoken character in their relationship. The disconnect was never clearer than when Keisha visited his shop. She would pull up in her white BMW 3 Series, a $43,000 car that her father had bought her as a welcome to adulthood present when she was 30. She would step out onto the oil-stained concrete in a pair of $1,200 Christian Louboutin heels, picking her way carefully around the tire stacks and tool chests as if navigating a minefield. "Baby, hi," she'd chirp, wrinkling her nose at the familiar, comforting smell of gasoline and coolant. "I brought you lunch." She would present him with a fancy paper bag from a new, trendy cafe, containing something like a $22 quinoa salad with microgreens and a lemon tahini dressing. Jerome, his hands covered in a thick layer of black grease from rebuilding a transmission, would just look at the bag, then at his hands, and smile a tired smile. "Thanks, honey, that looks clean." He knew she meant well, but it was a gesture born of complete non-comprehension. She didn't understand that his lunch was usually a $7 sandwich from the corner store, eaten in 5 minutes while standing over an engine block. She saw his work not as a craft or a passion, but as a dirty, slightly embarrassing hobby that inexplicably paid some of his bills. She loved the idea of him being a self-made man, but she couldn't stand the grit that self-making required. The beginning of the end came disguised as an act of generosity. About a year into their marriage, Jerome hit a rough patch. A new corporate-owned auto chain opened a few miles away, undercutting his prices and luring away some of his less loyal customers. He had a couple of slow months, and cash flow became tight. He mentioned it to Keisha one evening, venting his frustrations as they sat in their minimalist, professionally decorated living room, a room he lived in but had no say in. A week later, Marcus summoned him to his home office, a room paneled in dark wood and smelling of leather and money. "Keisha told me you're having some trouble," he said, getting straight to the point. He was behind a massive desk that looked like it had been carved from a single ancient tree. "We as a family want to help." Jerome felt a surge of gratitude mixed with shame. "Marcus, I appreciate that, but I can handle it. It's just a temporary downturn." "Nonsense," Marcus waved a dismissive hand. "Let us invest. We'll create a holding company, JAE Holdings LLC. We'll inject some capital, give you a cushion. It's just a formality to protect our investment. We'll take a 51% stake. You keep 49%. You're still the boss. You still run the show. This just makes it official. It brings you into the family business, so to speak." He presented Jerome with a stack of documents, prepared by his team of a dozen lawyers who billed at $1,200 per hour. Jerome, who had always handled his own simple business filings, felt overwhelmed. He saw words like capital infusion, shareholder agreement, and governance. It looked complicated, official. "Should I have my own lawyer look at this?" Jerome asked tentatively. Marcus chuckled, a deep, patronizing sound. "Jerome, I am your family. My lawyers are the best in the state. Do you think we would do anything to hurt you? This is to help you, to lift you up." Keisha was there too, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Baby, this is a good thing. It means they believe in you. It means we're all in this together." And so, wanting to believe them, wanting to feel like part of the family, Jerome signed. He signed away a majority stake in the business he had bled for, the one tangible thing in the world that was truly his. He thought he was signing a lifeline. He had no idea he was signing its death warrant. The document he signed that day was thick, and in his haste to show gratitude and not appear untrusting, he'd only skimmed the main pages. He didn't read every clause of every addendum. He had no idea what he had just given them. He was about to find out. The betrayal didn't come like a sudden thunderclap. It was a slow, creeping frost that started at the edges of their life and moved inward. It began the day the email arrived from A1 Couriers, his biggest client. For 3 years, Jerome had serviced their entire fleet of 22 vans. The contract represented nearly 40% of his revenue. The email was short, brutally corporate. "Dear vendor, please be advised that as of November 1st, A1 Couriers will be terminating our maintenance agreement. We have decided to move in a different direction. We thank you for your service." Jerome felt the blood drain from his face. He immediately called his contact, a guy named Dave he'd always had a good relationship with. Dave was evasive. "Sorry, Jerome. It came from the top. My hands are tied." The top was a man named Mr. Peterson, the owner of A1. Jerome had met him once. He was a gruff, old money type who, Jerome now recalled with a sickening lurch, played golf with Marcus every Thursday at the River Oaks Country Club. He drove home that evening in a daze, the world outside his windshield blurry and unreal. He walked into the house, a sprawling 7,000 square foot monument to modern architecture that had never once felt like his home. Keisha was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone, a glass of chilled white wine in her hand. "Keisha," he said, his voice hoarse, "I lost the A1 contract." She looked up from her phone, her brow furrowed not with concern but with annoyance at the interruption. "Oh, that's a shame." She took a sip of her wine. Well, what are you going to do now? There was no, what are we going to do? There was no comforting touch, no shared sense of crisis. There was only him, alone with his failure, and her, an observer waiting to see how he would fix it. In that moment, the frost reached his heart. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was in this alone. A few days later, the other shoe dropped. With the A1 contract gone, the shop's finances became untenable. The overhead on the large garage, the salaries for his 2 mechanics, he couldn't cover it. He spent 2 weeks trying to secure a bridge loan, calling in favors, trying to find new clients. But the hole was too big. With a heavy heart, he had to tell his guys, 2 good men with families, that he couldn't make payroll. He had to close the doors. That was the day Marcus and Eleanor appeared at the house, unannounced. They sat him down in the vast living room, the same spot where he would be formally exiled just a few weeks later. This was the preliminary hearing. Marcus, dressed in a casual but still obscenely expensive $800 cashmere polo shirt, adopted a somber tone that was completely unconvincing. "Jerome, we've heard the news. We're so sorry." He didn't look sorry. He looked like a predator who had just cornered his prey. "I've spoken with the accountants for the holding company. Given the dissolution of the primary asset, the shop, we're going to have to unwind the LLC." Jerome just stared at him, numb. "This arrangement," Marcus continued, steepling his fingers, "is no longer viable. The business was the connecting tissue. Without it, there's no foundation." It was the exact same speech he would give later, a rehearsed, soulless script. Eleanor, who had been silent, finally spoke. "Keisha has a certain standard of living, Jerome. A certain world she belongs in. We have to be practical." Jerome finally found his voice. He looked past them, at his wife, who was standing by the window, her back to him, looking out at the perfectly landscaped garden. "Keisha, are you hearing this? This is our life they're talking about." She turned, and her face was a mask of cold resignation. "They're right, Jerome. I can't do this. The struggle, the uncertainty. It's not who I am. The struggle." He had worked 60-hour weeks for 5 years to build that business. He had poured his sweat and his savings into it. He had done it for them. For her. To prove he was worthy of her world. And now that it was gone, she was telling him that his effort, his fight, was an inconvenience she was unwilling to endure. The ultimate humiliation came a week later. Months before, Keisha had bought a table for a $1,000 a plate charity gala for the Houston Children's Foundation. It was a major social event for their circle. Jerome, now effectively unemployed and on the verge of being homeless, begged her not to go. "Keisha, please. It doesn't feel right. I have nothing to wear, nothing to say to these people." "Don't be ridiculous," she'd scoffed. "We have to show our faces. What will people think if we don't show up?" So he went. He put on his one good suit, a simple black number that had cost $400 5 years ago. He felt like an imposter, a pauper, at the prince's ball. Keisha, on the other hand, was radiant in a new $8,700 Armani gown, her neck glittering with a diamond necklace her mother had loaned her for the evening. Throughout the night, he was a ghost at her side. When old acquaintances of her parents would ask him, "And what do you do, Jerome?" he would open his mouth to answer, but Keisha would always jump in first. "Jerome is exploring some new ventures," she'd say with a bright, false smile. Or, "He's in a transitional period." It was a verbal erasure. He wasn't a mechanic. He wasn't a business owner. He was a project, a problem, a man between opportunities. The lowest point of the evening came when he saw Marcus leading a man over to Keisha. The man was tall, handsome, and radiated the easy confidence of old money. Jerome recognized him as James Worthington, a high-powered attorney and one of the city's most eligible bachelors. Marcus made the introduction, pointedly ignoring Jerome, who stood just 5 feet away. "James, I'd like you to meet my daughter, Keisha. Keisha, James is a partner at Vincent & Elkins." Keisha laughed, a light, tinkling sound that Jerome had once loved. "A pleasure to meet you, James." She didn't even glance in Jerome's direction. He wasn't just being replaced. He was being forced to watch the casting for his replacement. He slipped away from the table, walking out onto a balcony overlooking the city skyline. The glass towers of downtown Houston, the very symbols of the power and wealth Marcus worshipped, seemed to mock him. He felt a profound and suffocating loneliness. They hadn't just decided he wasn't good enough. They were making sure the entire world knew it. He stood there for a long time, the cool night air doing nothing to quell the fire of shame and a new hardening anger in his chest. They had made a critical mistake. They thought that by taking his business, they had taken his power. They had no idea what was coming. Saturday, October 12th, 3:15 p.m. The air in the guest room of the River Oaks mansion was thick and still, heavy with the cloying scent of Eleanor's favorite $120 Joe Malone lime basil and mandarin diffusers. For Jerome, it was the smell of defeat. He was surrounded by cardboard boxes, a landscape of brown against the room's pristine beige walls. This room, with its ensuite bathroom and walk-in closet, was larger than the first apartment he'd ever rented. For the past 2 weeks, it had been his prison cell. He was supposed to be packing his personal belongings, the meager collection of items that defined his existence outside of this opulent cage. But instead of sorting through his worn paperbacks and old t-shirts, he found himself drawn to 3 boxes he'd hastily retrieved from the office of his now-defunct shop. They were labeled JAE, Corporate Docs, followed by the year. He knew he should just throw them out, let the past burn. But some instinct, some nagging feeling of an untied loose